It was a bright Tuesday morning at LaGuardia Airport when Dr. Maya Richardson pulled up to the private aviation terminal in her silver Tesla. The morning sun caught the golden highlights in her carefully braided hair as she stepped out of her car, dressed in a navy blue pantsuit that spoke of quiet confidence. At 35, she had already achieved what many medical professionals could only dream of, becoming one of the country's most respected neurosurgeons. As she collected her designer briefcase and carry-on luggage from the trunk, Dr. Richardson mentally reviewed the emergency procedure waiting for her in Boston. A 10-year-old patient needed urgent brain surgery, and she was the specialist called for the job. This wasn't her first time using the private terminal. In fact, she'd been making these emergency flights for the past 3 years, saving lives across different states. The clicking of her sensible heels echoed through the pristine terminal as she walked toward the security checkpoint. Her hospital credentials and pilot's license hung around her neck, bouncing slightly with each step. Few people knew that beyond her medical expertise, Dr. Richardson had earned her private pilot's license 2 years ago, not because she needed to fly the jets herself, but because she believed in fully understanding every aspect of her work, including the transportation that got her to her patients. Several regular staff members smiled and waved as they recognized her. Sarah from the coffee shop was already preparing Dr. Richardson's usual order, a double shot espresso with a splash of almond milk. The usual for our favorite surgeon, Sarah called out cheerfully. Dr. Richardson smiled warmly, grateful for the familiar faces who had become like family during her frequent trips. Today, however, something felt different. As she approached the main security checkpoint, she noticed an unfamiliar guard standing at the post. Thomas Weber was new to the job, having transferred from a regular commercial terminal just a week ago. He stood with his hands on his belt, watching Dr. Richardson with obvious suspicion as she approached. Dr. Richardson had unfortunately grown accustomed to these looks throughout her career. As one of the few black female neurosurgeons in the country, she had faced her share of skepticism and prejudice. But she had learned to handle such situations with grace and professionalism, letting her credentials and expertise speak for themselves. She began gathering her documents as she approached the checkpoint, maintaining her usual calm demeanor. The morning sunlight streaming through the terminal's large windows illuminated her face as she prepared to present her identification. Her mind was already in Boston, thinking about the young patient who needed her help. Other passengers in the terminal, mostly business executives and medical professionals, were going through their security checks without incident. The sound of pleasant conversation and rolling luggage filled the air, creating the usual morning buzz of the private aviation section. Weber's eyes narrowed as Dr. Richardson drew closer. She could see him straightening his posture, his hand adjusting his badge in what seemed like a display of authority. The other security staff members, who knew Dr. Richardson well, were busy with other travelers and hadn't noticed the brewing situation. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, reminding herself of what her mother had always told her. Your excellence is your armor, and your dignity is your sword. She had lived by these words throughout her career, using them as a guide whenever she faced prejudice or doubt. As she reached the checkpoint, Dr. Richardson smiled professionally and began to reach for her ID. But before she could even open her briefcase, Weber stepped forward with his hand raised, his face set in a stern expression that she had seen too many times before. The morning light caught the silver threads in his uniform as he moved to block her path. Behind him, the private jet that would take her to her patient in Boston was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, its white exterior gleaming in the sun. Time was of the essence, and Dr. Richardson knew that every minute counted when it came to emergency surgeries. Little did Weber know, this encounter would become a turning point not just for him, but for the entire private aviation company's approach to diversity and inclusion. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved, proving once again that books should never be judged by their covers. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you might be lost," Weber said, his voice carrying a mix of authority and condescension. "The main terminal for regular passengers is in the other building." He emphasized the word regular in a way that made his meaning clear to everyone within earshot. Dr. Richardson had been in similar situations before, but something about Weber's tone made this encounter different. She noticed how he deliberately avoided looking at her credentials, which were clearly visible around her neck. Instead, his eyes kept darting to her designer briefcase, as if trying to decide if it was real or fake. "I'm not lost," Dr. Richardson replied calmly, her voice steady and professional. "I'm Dr. Maya Richardson, and I have a private flight scheduled to Boston for an emergency surgery." She reached for her documents, but Weber stepped closer, forcing her to take a step back. "Listen, we get people confused all the time," Weber continued, speaking slowly as if talking to a child. "This is the private aviation terminal. These flights are very expensive, and they're usually for—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't get him in trouble. "Certain types of passengers." The coffee shop worker, Sarah, watched the scene unfold with growing concern. She had served Dr. Richardson her morning espresso just minutes ago and knew her as one of their most respected regular passengers. But before she could intervene, Weber pressed on with his interrogation. "I'm going to need to see every piece of identification you have," he demanded, his voice getting louder. "And I mean everything. We can't be too careful these days." Other passengers had stopped to watch, some shaking their heads in disapproval at Weber's behavior. Dr. Richardson maintained her composure as she opened her briefcase. Years of performing complex surgeries under pressure had taught her to stay calm in tense situations. She began laying out her documents one by one on the security desk: her hospital ID from Massachusetts General Hospital, her medical license, her board certification in neurosurgery, and her flight clearance papers. "These could be anybody's documents," Weber said dismissively, barely glancing at them. "How do I know they're really yours?" His skepticism was becoming more obvious by the minute, and a small crowd had begun to gather at a distance. Just then, Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the Boston hospital. The young patient's condition was deteriorating, and they needed her there as soon as possible. The pressure of time added to the tension of the moment, but she refused to let it show on her face. "Mr. Weber," she said, reading his name tag, "I understand you're doing your job, but I have a 10-year-old patient in Boston who needs emergency brain surgery. Every minute we spend here reduces their chances of a full recovery." She spoke clearly and professionally, despite the frustration building inside her. Weber crossed his arms, unmoved by her explanation. "Anyone can make up a story about being a doctor," he scoffed. "I've worked security for 15 years, and I know when something doesn't look right. This terminal is for real professional people." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on anyone watching. Dr. Richardson had performed over 1,000 successful surgeries, saved countless lives, and earned every credential she carried. Yet here she was, being told she didn't look professional enough to belong. Sarah finally couldn't stand it anymore and rushed to the phone behind her counter. She knew exactly who to call: Mr. Patterson, the terminal supervisor, who had always spoken highly of Dr. Richardson. As she dialed his number, she watched Weber continue his baseless questioning. "If you're really a doctor," Weber pressed on, "then why are you using the private terminal? Don't doctors usually fly commercial?" His questions became more pointed, each one revealing his prejudices more clearly than the last. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, remembering all the times she had faced similar barriers and broken through them. She reached for one final document in her briefcase, something that would change the entire dynamic of this confrontation. As she pulled out her private pilot's license, a slight smile crossed her face. Weber had no idea that he was about to learn a powerful lesson about making assumptions. The morning sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, illuminating the scene as it reached its turning point. In just a few moments, Weber's worldview was about to be severely shaken, and Dr. Richardson would once again prove why she had become a legend in both the medical and aviation communities. The private pilot's license in Dr. Richardson's hand caught Weber off guard. He stared at it for a long moment, his mouth slightly open, before quickly recovering his hostile demeanor. "This could be fake too," he said, but his voice had lost some of its previous confidence. "Mr. Weber," Dr. Richardson began, her patience starting to wear thin, "not only am I qualified to be a passenger on this flight, but I'm actually qualified to fly this jet myself." She pointed through the terminal windows at the gleaming private aircraft waiting on the tarmac. "Though today, I'm traveling as a passenger because I need to review my patient's files during the flight." Several other travelers had stopped pretending not to watch. A young business executive in an expensive suit pulled out his phone and started recording the scene. Another passenger recognized Dr. Richardson from a medical conference where she had been the keynote speaker. "That's Dr. Richardson," the passenger exclaimed loudly. She performed life-saving surgery on my daughter last year, but Weber seemed determined to stand his ground, even as his position became increasingly uncomfortable. Just then, Sarah's call to the supervisor paid off. Mr. Patterson burst through the staff door, slightly out of breath from rushing down from his office. He took in the scene before him, Dr. Richardson standing calmly with her documents spread out, Weber's red face, and the crowd of onlookers. "Dr. Richardson," Mr. Patterson called out, hurrying over. "Is there a problem here?" His face showed genuine concern as he approached. He had known Dr. Richardson for 3 years and had always admired her professionalism and expertise. Weber straightened his uniform, trying to maintain his authority. "Sir, I was just checking this person's credentials. They seem suspicious to me." The way he emphasized suspicious made several onlookers shake their heads in disgust. Mr. Patterson's face darkened. "Suspicious?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Dr. Richardson is one of our most valued clients. She's performed emergency surgeries that have saved lives in 3 different states. She flies through our terminal at least twice a week." As if to prove the point, 2 other security guards who had worked there longer came forward. "Good morning, Dr. Richardson," they said respectfully. "Your flight crew is ready whenever you are." Weber's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He looked from Mr. Patterson to Dr. Richardson, then back again. But she didn't look like she belonged here," he stammered, digging himself deeper into trouble. "And what exactly does someone who belongs here look like, Mr. Weber?" Mr. Patterson asked coldly. The terminal had gone completely quiet, everyone waiting to hear Weber's response. Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed again, another urgent message from Boston. The situation was becoming critical. She spoke up, her voice clear and professional as always. "Mr. Patterson, while I appreciate your intervention, my patient's condition is deteriorating. We need to resolve this quickly." Mr. Patterson nodded immediately. "Of course, doctor. Please, proceed to your flight. We'll deal with this situation appropriately." He gestured for the other security guards to escort her through. But Dr. Richardson paused for a moment. She turned to Weber, who was now staring at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "Mr. Weber," she said, causing him to look up reluctantly. "I hope this experience teaches you something valuable. Success, expertise, and professionalism don't have a specific look." The crowd of onlookers broke into spontaneous applause. Several people had their phones out, recording the entire exchange. One woman was already typing furiously on social media, no doubt sharing what she had just witnessed. As Dr. Richardson walked through security, accompanied by the other guards, she heard Mr. Patterson beginning to reprimand Weber. "In my office, now," he said firmly. "We need to have a serious discussion about profiling and company policy." The morning sun still streamed through the windows, now catching the wings of the private jet that would take Dr. Richardson to her patient in Boston. As she walked across the terminal, several people smiled and nodded at her in support. Sarah rushed out from behind her coffee counter, bringing Dr. Richardson a fresh espresso for her flight. "I'm so sorry about that, doctor," she said quietly. "Your usual double shot with almond milk." Dr. Richardson smiled warmly at Sarah, taking the coffee. "Thank you for making that call," she said. "Sometimes standing up for what's right requires a whole community." With those words, she headed toward her gate, her mind already focusing on the emergency surgery ahead. Behind her, the impact of what had just happened continued to ripple through the terminal, changing perspectives and challenging prejudices. As Dr. Richardson settled into her seat on the private jet, her mind was already shifting to her young patient in Boston. The morning's confrontation with Weber had taken precious minutes, but now she focused on reviewing the medical files spread out on the table before her. The flight crew moved efficiently around her, preparing for takeoff. Captain Laura Chen, who had flown Dr. Richardson many times before, stuck her head into the cabin. "We're cleared for priority takeoff, doctor. We'll make up the lost time in the air." She paused, then added, "Word of what happened in the terminal has already reached the tower. Air traffic control is giving us special clearance." Back in the terminal, the situation was far from over. Mr. Patterson sat behind his desk, looking sternly at Weber, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The security footage from the incident played on the computer screen between them. "Do you understand the severity of what you've done?" Mr. Patterson asked, pausing the video. Dr. Richardson isn't just any passenger. She's saved more lives than we can count. She's performed emergency surgeries in 3 different states. And more importantly, she's a human being who deserves respect, regardless of her achievements. Weber stared at his hands, his face still red with embarrassment. I was just trying to be thorough, he mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. The reality of his actions was finally sinking in. Meanwhile, social media was exploding with videos of the incident. The business executive who had recorded everything had posted it online, and it was already going viral. Comments poured in from people sharing similar experiences, while others expressed outrage at Weber's behavior. In the air, Dr. Richardson focused on her patient's scans. The 10-year-old had a rare brain condition that required immediate attention. As she studied the images, her phone buzzed with messages of support from colleagues who had already seen the viral videos. She put her phone on silent, choosing to concentrate on what mattered most: saving her patient's life. Back at LaGuardia, Mr. Patterson was implementing immediate changes. He called an emergency staff meeting, bringing in all security personnel from both shifts. Sarah from the coffee shop was invited to speak, sharing her perspective on how regular customers like Dr. Richardson should be treated. "This isn't just about one incident," Mr. Patterson explained to his staff. "This is about changing the culture. Every person who walks through our terminal deserves the same respect, regardless of their appearance, race, or background." Weber sat in the back of the meeting room, listening as his colleagues shared stories of their positive interactions with Dr. Richardson over the years. He learned how she had once helped a cleaner's child get specialized medical care, how she always remembered the names of the security staff's family members, and how she had given a young intern a recommendation letter that changed his life. Meanwhile, the private jet was approaching Boston. Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom. "Dr. Richardson, we've made up the lost time. We'll be landing in 7 minutes. There's an emergency medical team waiting to take you straight to the hospital." Dr. Richardson gathered her files, her mind clear and focused. The morning's incident had been unfortunate, but she had seen it as a teaching moment rather than just a personal offense. She'd hoped it would lead to positive changes. In the terminal meeting room, Mr. Patterson was wrapping up his presentation. "Starting today, we're implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff. And we're creating new guidelines for security checks that focus on documentation, not assumptions." Weber raised his hand slowly. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I'd like to volunteer to lead the first training session. I can share what I learned today. What I learned from Dr. Richardson. Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes." As Dr. Richardson's plane touched down in Boston, her phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages. News outlets wanted interviews, social media was trending with her story, and medical associations were citing her experience as a call for industry-wide change. But Dr. Richardson's mind was elsewhere. As she rushed to the waiting ambulance, her focus was entirely on her young patient. She had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence, and right now, excellence meant doing what she did best: saving lives. The emergency surgery in Boston lasted 6 hours. Dr. Richardson stood focused at the operating table, her skilled hands working with precision to save the young patient's life. The operating room staff moved in perfect sync with her, having heard about the morning's events but seeing, once again, why she was considered one of the best surgeons in the country. "Suction here, please," she said calmly, her eyes fixed on the delicate brain tissue before her. The morning's confrontation with Weber felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the intense concentration required for such a complex procedure. Meanwhile, back at LaGuardia's private terminal, things were changing rapidly. Mr. Patterson had spent the afternoon rewriting security protocols with his team. The new guidelines emphasized reviewing documents rather than making assumptions about passengers. Weber, still shaken by the morning's events, had volunteered to help. "I never thought about how my actions could affect someone's life," Weber admitted during the planning session. "While I was busy questioning Dr. Richardson's credentials, her patient's condition was getting worse. Minutes can mean everything in emergency medical situations." Sarah, the coffee shop worker, had become something of a local hero among the staff. Her quick thinking in calling Mr. Patterson had helped resolve the situation. During her afternoon break, she checked her phone and saw that the video of the incident had reached over 1 million views. Look at these comments, she showed her coworkers. People are sharing similar stories from airports all over the country. Dr. Richardson's experience is starting a bigger conversation about prejudice in professional spaces. In the Boston operating room, Dr. Richardson was completing the final, crucial steps of the surgery. The procedure had been particularly challenging, but her morning experience had only strengthened her focus. She had channeled all her energy into what mattered most, saving her patient's life. Surgery successful, she announced finally, stepping back from the operating table. The room burst into applause, not just for the successful operation, but for everything Dr. Richardson represented. The operating room staff had seen the viral video too, and their respect for her had grown even deeper. Back in New York, Weber sat alone in the break room, watching the security footage of his interaction with Dr. Richardson for the 5th time. Each viewing made him more uncomfortable, seeing his own biases played back on screen. He pulled out a notebook and began writing what would become the foundation for the terminal's new training program. Mr. Patterson received an email from the airport's board of directors. They had seen the viral video and were implementing similar changes across all terminals. Your private terminal will serve as a model for our new diversity and inclusion protocols, the email read. In Boston, as Dr. Richardson scrubbed out after surgery, her phone buzzed with a message from the young patient's parents. They had heard about the morning's incident and written a heartfelt thank you note. You overcame discrimination this morning and still saved our daughter's life this afternoon. You're not just a brilliant surgeon, you're a role model for our child. The message touched Dr. Richardson deeply. She remembered her own challenges in medical school, the doubts people had cast on her abilities, and how she had proven them wrong time after time. Today was just another example of turning an obstacle into an opportunity for change. At LaGuardia, the evening shift was starting, and the story of the morning's events was being passed on. New security staff listened intently as their colleagues explained the changes being implemented. Sarah had put up a small sign in her coffee shop that read, "Respect first, questions later." Weber stayed late that evening, working with Mr. Patterson on the new training materials. They included real-world examples of prejudice and its consequences, using the morning's incident as a case study. Weber's perspective had shifted dramatically in just one day. As the sun set over both cities, two different but connected stories were unfolding. In Boston, a young patient was beginning her recovery, saved by the skilled hands of a doctor who had overcome discrimination to reach her. And in New York, a security guard was learning that his mistake could become a powerful tool for positive change. The events of that morning had started a ripple effect that would continue to spread, challenging prejudices and changing policies far beyond the walls of one private terminal. 2 days after the successful surgery, Dr. Richardson sat in her office at Massachusetts General Hospital, reviewing her patient's recovery progress. The young girl, Emily, was doing remarkably well, already showing signs of improvement that exceeded expectations. Outside her office, the story of what happened at LaGuardia continued to spread. Her office phone rang. It was CNN requesting an interview. It was the 5th media request that morning alone. Dr. Richardson had politely declined them all, preferring to let her work speak for itself. She believed real change happened through actions, not television appearances. Meanwhile, back at LaGuardia's private terminal, Weber was leading his first training session. The room was packed with security staff, not just from the private terminal, but from other parts of the airport too. His hands shook slightly as he stood at the podium. 3 days ago, I was the example of what not to do, Weber began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I almost delayed an emergency surgery. The room was silent, everyone listening intently to his story. Mr. Patterson sat at the back of the room, watching with approval. The incident had transformed Weber from a problem employee into an unexpected advocate for change. On the screen behind Weber, security footage from that morning played, now being used as a teaching tool. In Boston, Emily's parents sat beside their daughter's hospital bed, watching her play with a toy doctor kit the nurses had given her. I want to be just like Dr. Richardson when I grow up, Emily announced, holding up her plastic stethoscope. Her parents smiled, knowing their daughter had found a powerful role model. Dr. Richardson's colleague, Dr. James Chen, knocked on her office door. Maya, you should see this, he said, holding up his tablet. The American Medical Association had just released a statement addressing discrimination in medical transportation. They cited the LaGuardia incident as a catalyst for new industry-wide guidelines. Back in New York, Sarah's coffee shop had become a discussion hub for airport staff. She had created a wall of excellence where she posted stories of remarkable passengers who used the terminal, doctors, pilots, business leaders, and humanitarian workers of all backgrounds. The thing is, Sarah explained to a customer while making an espresso, Dr. Richardson was already a regular here. She had already proven herself countless times. But why should anyone have to constantly prove they belong? Weber's training session continued with role-playing exercises. Staff members acted out different scenarios, learning to check credentials without making assumptions. Remember, Weber said, the next person you profile might be rushing to save someone's life. At Dr. Richardson's office, another email arrived, this time from a young black medical student. Your story inspired me, the email read. When people tell me I don't look like a future doctor, I think of you standing your ground at that airport. Thank you for showing us how to face discrimination with dignity. The terminal's new policies were already showing results. Mr. Patterson received reports of improved passenger satisfaction. More importantly, staff members were having open discussions about their own biases and how to overcome them. Emily's recovery continued to improve. During Dr. Richardson's rounds, she found her young patient sitting up in bed, her toy doctor kit arranged neatly on her bedside table. Dr. Richardson, Emily said excitedly, my mom showed me the video from the airport. You're so brave. Dr. Richardson sat on the edge of Emily's bed. Being brave means doing what's right, even when it's hard, she explained gently. But you know what makes me happiest? Seeing you getting better every day. At LaGuardia, Weber finished his training session to unexpected applause. Several staff members stayed behind to share their own stories of times they had made assumptions about passengers. The conversation was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. As evening approached, Dr. Richardson prepared to head back to New York. There would be other patients, other emergencies, other flights. But something had changed. Her experience had opened doors for conversations that needed to happen, not just in one airport terminal, but across the country. The incident that could have been just another story of discrimination had instead become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most difficult moments. 1 month after the incident, Dr. Richardson stood once again in LaGuardia's private terminal. The atmosphere was noticeably different. New signs hung on the walls promoting diversity and inclusion, and the security staff wore pins that read, "Respect first." Weber was on duty that morning, but he wasn't the same person who had confronted her a month ago. When he saw Dr. Richardson, he straightened his uniform and approached her with genuine respect. Dr. Richardson, he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse, I've been hoping to see you again. I owe you a proper apology. He held out a folder containing statistics from the new training program he had helped develop. Because of you, we trained over 300 staff members across different airports. Dr. Richardson accepted the folder with a nod. She had heard about Weber's transformation through Sarah, who still made her perfect espresso every time she flew. The coffee shop's wall of excellence had grown, now featuring dozens of stories about remarkable passengers from all walks of life. Mr. Weber, she replied, sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our most important work. She gestured to the changes visible throughout the terminal. What matters is what we learn and how we grow from those mistakes. Meanwhile, Emily, her young patient from Boston, had made a full recovery. She had started a club at her elementary school called Future Doctors of America, inspired by Dr. Richardson's story. The club welcomed children of all backgrounds who dreamed of careers in medicine. Mr. Patterson approached with exciting news. Dr. Richardson, our new training program has been adopted by 20 other airports across the country, he announced proudly. Your experience here has changed how airports handle security nationwide. The morning news played quietly on the terminal's TVs, showing a report about changes in the aviation industry. The reporter mentioned how one incident at LaGuardia had sparked a national conversation about prejudice and professionalism. Sarah brought over Dr. Richardson's espresso, but this time it came with a small gift, a framed photo of the coffee shop's first Wall of Excellence post, which had featured Dr. Richardson's story. You started something important here, Sarah said with a smile. Weber had been watching his own transformation featured in training videos across the country. His honest acknowledgement of his mistakes and his efforts to create change had made him an unexpected champion for diversity in the aviation security sector. We have a new protocol now, Weber explained to Dr. Richardson as he checked her credentials, not because he needed to, but to demonstrate the new procedure. We focus on documentation and facts, never on appearances or assumptions. The terminal's regular passengers had noticed the changes too. Business executives, pilots, and medical professionals of all backgrounds reported feeling more welcome. The security checks were still thorough, but were conducted with respect and professionalism. Dr. Richardson's phone buzzed with a message from Emily's parents. They had sent a photo of Emily wearing a toy stethoscope and a small white coat, with the caption, "Her school science fair project is about brain surgery. You've inspired her in more ways than one." As she waited for her flight, Dr. Richardson observed the morning rush in the terminal. She watched as Weber and his colleagues professionally handled security checks for a diverse group of passengers. Each person was treated with the same respect, their credentials checked with the same thoroughness. Mr. Patterson shared more updates about the terminal's progress. The staff turnover rate had dropped, passenger complaints had decreased significantly, and they had received recognition from civil rights organizations for their improved practices. Your patience that day, Mr. Patterson said. Your decision to handle the situation with dignity rather than anger. It changed everything. We could have just fired Weber and moved on, but your approach led to real, lasting change. As Dr. Richardson boarded her flight, she reflected on how one difficult morning had sparked a movement. The incident hadn't just changed one airport terminal. It had opened a door for conversations about respect, prejudice, and professionalism across the entire aviation industry. Weber watched her plane take off, standing a little straighter in his uniform. He had learned that true security came not from suspicion and bias, but from respect, proper procedures, and treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their appearance. 6 months after the incident, LaGuardia's private terminal hosted a special event. The airport authority had chosen this location to launch their new nationwide diversity and inclusion program. Dr. Richardson had been invited as the keynote speaker, though she had initially hesitated to accept. The terminal looked different now. Professional photographs lined the walls, showing the diverse faces of aviation, pilots, doctors, executives, and crew members from all backgrounds. Sarah's Wall of Excellence had inspired similar displays at airports across the country. Weber stood at his security post, wearing a new badge that identified him as the head of diversity training. In the past 6 months, he had traveled to 30 different airports, sharing his story and teaching others how to avoid the mistakes he had made. I never expected to be standing here today, Weber said to a group of new security officers. 6 months ago, I was the problem. Today, I'm part of the solution. His honesty about his past mistakes had made him an effective teacher for others. Dr. Richardson arrived early for the event, greeted by familiar faces. Sarah had prepared a special coffee bar for the occasion, and the morning sunlight streamed through the terminal windows, just as it had on that fateful day 6 months ago. Emily and her parents had flown in specially for the event. Now fully recovered, Emily ran up to Dr. Richardson wearing a miniature doctor's coat with "Future Neurosurgeon" embroidered on the pocket. Her school club, Future Doctors of America, had grown to over 50 members. Dr. Richardson. Emily called out excitedly. I got an A+ on my brain surgery project. She pulled out a carefully created model of the human brain, showing it proudly to everyone nearby. The terminal staff gathered around, amazed by the young girl's knowledge. Mr. Patterson welcomed everyone to the event, standing beside a large screen showing the new training videos that would be used nationwide. What happened in this terminal 6 months ago could have ended very differently, he began. Instead, it became a catalyst for positive change. The audience included airport directors from across the country, all eager to implement similar changes in their own facilities. They had seen how LaGuardia's private terminal had transformed from a place of confrontation to a model of inclusion. When it was time for Dr. Richardson to speak, she surprised everyone by inviting Weber to join her at the podium. Real change, she began, happens when we face our mistakes openly and work together to do better. Weber shared his perspective, his voice steady and confident. Dr. Richardson could have demanded my firing that day. Instead, her response taught all of us, about dignity, professionalism, and the importance of looking beyond our biases. Sarah presented a special album she had created, documenting the terminal's transformation through photos and stories. The final page showed Dr. Richardson and Weber standing together, symbolizing how confrontation had turned into collaboration. Emily's mother stood up to share their story, moving many to tears as she described how her daughter's life had been saved because Dr. Richardson had maintained her composure despite discrimination. She didn't just save Emily's life, her mother said, she showed her how to face injustice with grace. The event concluded with the unveiling of a new plaque in the terminal. It read, "Every journey begins with respect. Every passenger deserves dignity." Below these words was an image of the sunrise over the terminal, representing new beginnings. As people mingled after the ceremony, Dr. Richardson noticed something remarkable. The terminal had become more than just a passage point for travelers. It had become a symbol of how positive change could grow from difficult moments. Weber approached her one last time. "You know, Dr. Richardson, that morning changed more than just our terminal. It changed me. It changed how we see each other. It changed everything." Dr. Richardson smiled, watching Emily excitedly showing her brain model to a group of pilots. "Change happens one person at a time, one moment at a time," she replied. "We just have to be brave enough to face those moments when they come." As the sun set on the event, the terminal buzzed with energy and hope. What had started as one woman standing her ground had grown into a movement that touched countless lives. The story of the racist guard and the black doctor had become more than just a viral video. It had become a blueprint for turning prejudice into progress, one airport at a time.